Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Public Information Officer for APA's Northern New England chapter, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast series. This series is brought to you by a consortium of over 40 of APA's chapters and divisions. The consortium itself is not affiliated with APA, but is rather a loose-knit association whose mission is to provide high-quality free webinars on topics important to planners that will also help them meet their certification maintenance requirements. Today, Friday, February 19th, 2016, we'll hear the presentation, Fair Housing, Serious Responsibility, Serious Liability. For technical help during today's webcast, please type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown for truly difficult technical questions that I can't help you with. For content-related questions related to the presentation, please type those questions in the question box, also located on the webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. We will answer those questions as time allows at the end of the presentation during Q&A. On your screen now is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. I want to thank all of them, all of the participating sponsors, for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Housing and Community Development Division of APA. And here is a list of a few upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit our new website, www.ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please follow these instructions on your screen. Go to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account. You can navigate to planning.org/CM, select Activities by Provider at the top, and type in Housing and Community Development, and then select this by title, Fair Housing, and so on. Or you can also search by the event number, 9012937. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM law credits for live viewing only. You can like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series sponsored by you, chapters and divisions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available on the Ohio Planning website. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Heidi Aguilar. Heidi is a managing director of BBC Research and Consulting in Denver, Colorado, and directs the firm's housing and human services practice areas. Heidi's practice focuses on assessments of fair housing, workforce and affordable housing demand analyses, and human service needs assessments, including childcare. Prior to joining BBC, Heidi worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. She received a BA in accounting from the University of Utah and an MPA in policy analysis from the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. Heidi's been invited to speak about her work conducting housing market studies and fair housing research at conferences held by HUD, the American Planning Association, the Rocky Mountain Land Institute, and many state and local housing and civil rights agencies. Heidi's been a board member of the Mile High Community Development Loan Fund and the Denver School of the Arts Collaborative School Committee. She has also volunteered for animal rescues, provided income tax preparation assistance to low-income families, and avidly supports community theater and classical guitar. Heidi, take it away.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very happy to be here today doing the webinar. Thank you to everyone who's attending the webinar, which is to discuss a very, very important topic and quite an emerging issue in both housing and fair housing. I have been working in this industry for about 17 years and conducted more than 100 consolidated plans and fair housing studies. And part of our approach to fair housing today, as well as what you'll hear from me today, is informed by our engagement with HUD, with fair housing advocates, and with our clients. A brief example of that, in the last year and a half, we worked pretty closely with Apt Associates out of the Washington, D.C. area to help advise HUD on the Assessment of Fair Housing template, with which many of you are familiar, I'm sure, and we'll talk about today. We helped as practitioners, we were part of a team as practitioners to help HUD think about how the AFH template and the data and maps that HUD would be providing to units of local government and states could be very useful in helping grantees think about fair housing challenges, as well as to provide them with a framework to analyze fair housing. Today I'm going to talk about two broad items. I'm going to introduce federal fair housing law. I'll focus on the very recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling and talk about the new HUD rule, both that influences disparate impact as well as the assessment of fair housing. Then I'm going to focus on the implementation of those two decisions and rules through the assessment of fair housing, or which I will call the AFH. I do want to note that most of my conversation with you all today will be less about the legal application of these decisions and more about the policy applications of the AFH for you who are making programmatic as well as policy decisions on a regular basis. A bit of background so that we're all on the same page and have an equal understanding of fair housing laws that have driven a lot of the thinking about fair housing recently. The Federal Housing Act was initially part of the Civil Rights Act. It was an add-on to the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It initially prohibited discrimination in the sale of rental and financing of dwellings based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So the initial law looked different than what we know it to be today. This is because it was amended in 1988 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, familial status, as well as to require accessible units be developed as part of multifamily units for developments built after 1991. There are some exemptions from the Federal Fair Housing Act. Housing developments that are primarily for seniors, housing that is strictly reserved for members of religious organizations or private clubs, and multifamily housing of 4 units or fewer with the owner occupying one of those units do not need to comply with the Federal Fair Housing Act. We've seen some recent trends that have not led to a modification of the Federal Fair Housing Act yet, but have seen implementation within HUD programs and some suggested areas of examination by HUD. Those include sexual orientation. As of a couple years ago, HUD prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in HUD-funded housing programs. And there's certainly been a growing interest in source of income protections at both the state and local level. You see that reflected now in the AFH guidelines that HUD produced a couple of months ago. Few legal definitions that apply to the Federal Fair Housing Act as well as many state laws. Dwelling in the Federal Fair Housing Act means any building, structure, or portion thereof which is occupied as or designed or intended for occupancy as a residence by one or more families, as well as any vacant land which is offered for sale or lease for the construction or location of some type of residential building. What's important about this definition is that definition has come into play when there have been questions about the treatment of persons in homeless shelters and whether or not a shelter is considered a dwelling. Much of what we know the Federal Fair Housing Act to be has been very heavily influenced by case law because it is a simplistic act in its nature. Discrimination in the Federal Fair Housing Act means to refuse to sell or rent after the making of a bona fide offer, or to refuse to negotiate for the sale or rental of, or otherwise make unavailable or deny a dwelling. So in the last two slides, you see that the Federal Fair Housing Act really focuses on the dwelling unit. There are protected classes, but the dwelling, the actual application of that dwelling or availability of that dwelling to those protected classes is where the Act focuses. Second piece of discrimination that's important is the reasonable accommodations provision. So in the Federal Fair Housing Act, discrimination also means a refusal to make a reasonable accommodation in rules, policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford references a person with disability, equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. And in many of the cases that are associated with reasonable accommodation, we see a lot of questioning around that reasonable use and enjoyment. How is that defined? What does that mean in the context of reasonable accommodation? So let me back up just a moment before I jump in to the assessment of fair housing. HUD has issued 2 documents. One is the assessment of fair housing template that will be required soon for many of you, and the other is the guidance. It's called the guidebook, and that's the big document. It's probably about 500 pages long. On page 4 of that guidance, which discusses the philosophy behind the AFH, HUD talks about the fair housing law as enabling choice. And this is a nice discussion to read because it goes beyond just the straight language of the law, but talks about the application and how HUD has been required to apply fair housing principles in its administration of programs and what that means for affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I encourage you to read and definitely pay attention to many segments of that AFH guidance. It gives you a good sense of where HUD's coming from in crafting the template. Last year, there were one really big change in federal fair housing law, or how we think about fair housing, which then did lead to the finalization of the assessment of fair housing template. That would be a decision in June 2015, where the U.S. Supreme Court found disparate impact, the idea of disparate impact, which we see in employment law, to also apply under the Federal Fair Housing Act. HUD had previously issued a disparate impact regulation. There was some question about how far that regulation could be implemented without the Supreme Court ruling. What does this mean for those of us who operate in the planning and housing field? At the very basic level, it means that disparate impact claims can be brought under the Federal Fair Housing Act, but there are a lot of limitations in that Supreme Court decision. And those limitations are intentional to prevent against overbroad disparate impact claims. So to bring a disparate impact claim, a plaintiff must identify a specific policy and show it is actually the cause of that disparity. Just focusing on racial imbalance, so a statistical difference between home ownership, for example, of persons of different races and ethnicities is not enough to bring a disparate impact claim. The process to bring a disparate impact claim is also described in the opinion associated with the Supreme Court ruling. The plaintiff initially has the burden of proving that the practice caused, and caused is a really important word. Again, thinking back to that statistical disparity, it's not enough just to have a statistical disparity. You have to show causation, which is a very high standard in statistics. So the plaintiff needs to show that that practice caused or predictably will cause a discriminatory effect. The defendant then has the opportunity to prove that the practice is necessary to achieve one or more substantial, legitimate, and non-discriminatory interests. It's borrowed a bit from employment law. And the plaintiff can still prevail by proving that that challenged practice could be served by another practice that has a less discriminatory effect. So what you all should be thinking is, wow, there are a lot of changes that have happened, including the assessment of fair housing template, which I'll talk about in just a moment. How do these laws affect how I think about planning and policy in my community? The one thing that I would like to emphasize the most here on this slide that I feel like there is some element of misunderstanding around is just because you don't receive CDBG or the entitlement dollars that trigger the affirmatively furthering fair housing language, you do need to comply with the Federal Fair Housing Act and disparate impact. So a disparate impact claim can be brought against your community even though you may not receive HUD dollars. There's no exemption if you're not getting block grant funds or other federal housing funds. However, if you are required, because you do receive federal funds, to complete an assessment of fair housing, you may have greater scrutiny just because you're going through that process and there's a document out there for public review. Some of the other really big changes within the world of affirmatively furthering fair housing include the assessment of fair housing. And this is sort of a big change and sort of not. Since the Community Development Block Grant was established many, many years ago, communities have been required to sign a certification with their annual application to HUD that promises to affirmatively further fair housing choice. We call this AFFH. Now that AFFH language was part of the original Fair Housing Act, so that's not something new or specific to CDBG. But what it means is HUD, remember, has a responsibility under the Federal Fair Housing Act to affirmatively further fair housing through its provision of federal dollars. So when HUD chose initially through CDBG to decentralize housing programming, that responsibility was then put upon the recipients of those block grants. So as a recipient of CDBG, Home, ESG, those are the big ones, you have an obligation to help HUD affirmatively further fair housing because that's tied to those federal program dollars. Typically, that has been what HUD is required to AFFH is the completion of an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, what we used to call an AI. The enforcement of AIs was pretty soft until many years ago when the Westchester case in New York occurred. This case, which actually was brought not under the Fair Housing Law, but under the Federal False Claims Act, this case combined with a GAO audit of HUD's application of AFFH through AIs caused stricter enforcement of that obligation, which then resulted in the new AFH. A little bit of timeline on how that occurred. In July 2013, HUD issued a proposed rule to clarify and strengthen AIs. So remember, this was influenced by both the Westchester litigation as well as more recently the GAO audit. That template, there were a couple public comments for that template. HUD released not only a rule but a draft assessment tool, so giving communities an idea of what HUD would be requiring under the new AI approach. It's another 30-day public comment, which occurred right after, so there were some revisions in between. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of disparate impact. There was a 30-day public comment, and then on December 31st, a little New Year's present for us all, HUD released the final AFH. A lot of questions that we have had have been not associated with the AFH content, but the initial question was, when do I have to do this? Because I'm concerned I need to get started early on. There was some language in the initial rule that was, I felt, a little confusing about when a community needs to start an AFH and when it should turn that into HUD. Before the AFH rule, AIs, the communities had a lot of, I guess I would say, options or freedom in turning in an AI to HUD. Some AIs were just kept within the community, and then if HUD came and did an audit, they would review it then. The timeline for AIs was pretty flexible. Some people decided to turn it in with the consolidated plan. Others, if they were doing a regional AI, for example, had a different time frame. The HUD rule clarifies when AFHs are expected to be turned in, and that's basically 9 months before the new 3 to 5 year consolidated plan begins. So for example, if your plan began, so your new consolidated plan began on January 2017, you'd need to have your AI done in April 2016, and there are some grantees who are already held to that. Not everybody right now has to fill out or complete the AFH template. HUD has been working on a unique template for states as well as a template for joint or regional collaborations, PHAs submitting alone, or collaborations among PHAs. So right now the AFH tool applies to local governments receiving CDBG, Home, ESG, or HOPWA funds, and who are doing that AFH alone, or some segments of joint or regional collaborations that aren't as complicated as those who will be using a different tool. When we were initially looking at the first template back in 2013, helped HUD think through what a state tool may look like. And it's a little more complicated, both in terms of the data that are available, how to view the data through HUD's community planning and AI, their data and mapping tool, as well as questions about authority, what in some cases states can't do a lot to address local barriers. So my understanding is that that template is in process. With that, I'm going to start to talk about some of the specifics of the AFH. I'm not going to regurgitate what you all see in the template or what's in the guidebook. I'll refer back to the guidebook where I think that it offers very useful information. I'm going to talk about what I think the biggest changes are from an AI. And there's a wide, in our experience, there's a wide variety of AI approaches, a significant disparity in how people were approaching an AI as well as the type of resources that they were putting toward an AI. And AFH brings that standard of both community input as well as analysis more narrow than it has been in the past. The AFH may mean more work for some of you and less work for some of you. But in its best, I think that it helps us all understand how we need to be looking at fair housing, whereas before the AFH, there was a lot of disparities and a lot of questions about what not only the research that influenced the AI meant, but what was an acceptable action plan? How far did communities have to go in addressing those barriers? One of the biggest differences between an AI and the AFH, in my opinion, is the community input requirement. There was, in the old guidance, some ideas for community input. The old guidance did a very nice job of providing sample questions to ask of both stakeholders and items to include in surveys if one was to survey stakeholders or residents. But it was confusing in terms of how far those community participation requirements had to resemble the con plan requirements, if the AI had to go through a public comment period, for example. And so the way that communities were enabling community input for the AI varied considerably. What's required in the AFH is to describe outreach activities undertaken to encourage the community participation. So you need to tell HUD how hard you tried in getting community input. This includes identifying the media outlets used, a description of efforts made to reach the public, and that should really focus on representing populations that are typically underrepresented in the planning process. So it's not enough just to post something on a website or do a public notice like is common with consolidated plans and say, we're holding a public meeting to discuss the AI, please come. You need to really get into the communities, make more of a grassroots effort to touch people who have not been involved in this process in the past. HUD's going to ask you directly, how successful are these efforts? Did you get the kind of participation that you should get if you were to try really hard to get people involved, or did it not work so well, and what maybe would you change in the future? The bare minimum is to summarize all comments obtained in that participation process, and much like the consolidated plan, include a summary of any comments or views not accepted and the reasons why. So a lot of this language is going to feel like it's borrowed from the citizen participation piece of the consolidated plan, but when you really dig into the guidebook, start thinking about what HUD wants, it is more. My recommendation here would to really make a sincere effort. So copying a survey that you've used in the past or that your consultants used in other communities is probably not sincere enough for HUD. You need to do a lot of work up front, which will yield quite a bit of benefits later on. Some examples of how we've approached this: we typically will do targeted focus groups, so small invitation-only focus groups with protected classes, those protected classes that are largest in a community, as well as those that probably haven't had their voices heard in the past, or who may have difficulty because of their work schedules, because they may have a challenge with a developmental disability in participating in a standard public process. One of the items we've been working on quite a bit and we've employed in some of our recent clients is to do community celebration events. So we're going into neighborhoods, we're celebrating the neighborhood, we're celebrating the people and the service providers in those neighborhoods. And then we've got exercises that don't feel like direct exercises, but exercises to help people talk to us about what housing challenges they face, and then also help us understand what solutions they'd like to see to help them and their neighbors with housing challenges. We also do a lot of focus group with stakeholders, and then if the budget allows, do resident surveys, again, tailored for that community. The initial template that guides the AFH separates the issues into several areas. Those include the demographic summary, segregation and integration, which I'll talk about and define in just a moment, RCAPS and ECAPS, an indicator of segregation and integration, disparities in access to opportunity, a very broad category which HUD provides quite a bit of data for, and disproportionate housing needs. That's all under the analysis category. There's also a required publicly supported housing analysis. Some grantees have done that as part of their AIs in the past, but I would say for the vast majority of you, this is going to be new. That's also true of the disability and access analysis. This is something that we helped Apt Associates work on when we started this process in 2013, and we personally felt had been missing from many of the AIs and the guidebook in the past, and is certainly a growing concern as our country ages. And then finally, sort of the wrap-up is looking at fair housing enforcement, outreach capacity, and resources analysis. So what's available in the community to help residents find out more about fair housing, to get questions about their situation, to file a complaint if they wanted to. My recommendation for how you apply this feels really overwhelming when you first sit down with that template. But remember, you've got a lot of data that HUD gives you, which is wonderful. So you've got to start, you're not collecting all this data yourself, which can take a lot of time. But to think about what analysis should I conduct before I go into the public process. I want to know what are the data telling me first, and then that tells me what I can talk to people about. So we'll typically get the public process planned and going while we're doing the analysis, and then that analysis informs the dialogue that we have during the public process. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the definitions behind the analysis in aspects of the AFH, which we find to be challenging for some people and are probably new for many of you. The other piece of this that I think is a little bit challenging is in talking. Now you're required, of course, to have a public comment period, and that probably involves some type of a city council or committee presentation. Some of this data, particularly segregation and concentrations, can be very, very sensitive. And councils, depending on their level of sophistication with data analysis, may have a hard time understanding what some of this means. So I want to take some time to help you all understand how to think about these indicators. It's not completely transparent in some of the guidebook descriptions, so that then you are empowered to do a good job of communicating this to your leadership. Segregation, the way that we think about segregation is that these are areas of concentration due to policies, programs, or discrimination. So you can have an area of what we call concentration because people have chosen to live in a neighborhood, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't know that just based on the data. That's why you need to get into the community and talk to people and understand why they've made the choices that they have. Concentrations can be due to housing preferences, but segregation is caused by more than just housing preferences. So zoning that historically has kept people out. It can be due to lack of diversity of housing, particularly multifamily stock in certain neighborhoods, and it could be due to blatant discrimination. So for HUD purposes, when you look at segregation and integration, we typically just think about racial and ethnic segregation, but HUD wants you to look at more than race and ethnicity. You should also be looking at national origin. You get indicators in the AFH for that, as well as limited English proficiency. The way that that plays out within the census data is something called linguistic isolation. So there's a number of variables within the census data that feed the data you're provided through the AFH that look at how well residents within a household can speak English. You also need to look at the distribution of residents by their poverty status, by their disability status, and for single families, for familial status, we typically focus on single parents and large families for two reasons. Single parents tend to have very high rates of poverty relative to the community overall. And large families tend to have a lot of challenges. It's not universally true, but it's true in many communities. They have a harder time finding housing and finding affordable housing that meets their family size and needs. We start with concentration. So we'll start with the maps that show where people that represent all of those indicators I just discussed live. HUD presents these as dot density maps. Many of you who know GIS are familiar with those types of maps. That's a dot that represents a person or a number of people spread on a map. You have the ability through the AFH template to show different layers, and so you can look at just one population in isolation, or you can overlay those. When budget allows, we typically will supplement those dot density maps with maps that show shades of concentration based on that level of concentration relative to the community overall. So we like to norm that indicator of segregation to the region or to the county so that we can understand where there are variances. Sometimes in communities that are really, really diverse or not diverse at all, it's hard to use those dot density maps to recognize where segregation occurs. Integration is talked about in the AFH, but it's really up to you to identify what integration means. And much like segregation, the idea of integration should be relative to what's going on in the community or the region. What we've typically looked at, on the basis of integration, is areas that are not segregated, but we typically will look at areas that have both a diverse socioeconomic base because economics drives so much of affordability. So where the income or the racial and ethnic distribution are representative of the region overall. To give you a little bit of an example, we did an exercise for the Houston-Galveston Planning Council a few years ago where we defined income and had a mixed income variable. So we looked at how income categories, the number of households that fall in different income categories for the region overall. We defined low income, middle income, and high income. We had an index that represented the balance of those three categories that was representative of the region, and then used that index to identify areas that were above, significantly above or below that ideal. RCAPS and ECAPS, another probably very new variable, unless, for those of you who have done FIA through the Sustainable Communities Act, you may have had some relationship with an RCAP and ECAP, but for many of you, this is new. And the idea behind an RCAP and ECAP is that because people house themselves in different areas based on preferences, and that can lead to some elements of concentration, and in most communities that are diverse, you do see concentrated areas. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's segregation. And what we really care about is concentrated areas that are also high poverty, because that's an indication that there may be some discrimination at play, that there's a lack of diversity of housing market-wide. And what HUD really worries about is people who don't have any choices beyond a high poverty neighborhood. So RCAPS and ECAPS are defined as racially and ethnically concentrated areas. For a metro area, that's typically an area where, or a neighborhood where the population of that race or ethnicity makes up 50% or more of the residents, plus a 40% family poverty rate or higher, or a poverty rate that exceeds three times the region's rate. This is actually kind of a complicated thing to map, but don't worry, HUD gives you, so in the AFH tool that you'll use to create your maps, HUD provides those RCAPs and ECAPS. It shows you where those are. What's important for you all to know is what's behind that RCAP and ECAP. So when you're presenting the information to city council or residents or stakeholders and they ask what that is, simply say these are racially and ethnically concentrated areas that also have very high poverty rates. The dissimilarity index, much like the RCAPs and ECAPS, probably a very new variable, something that you haven't dealt with in the past, and it can be kind of complicated. The way that we think about the dissimilarity index is that it measures the evenness in which two separate groups are distributed across geographic units, such as a county. The index, the map behind it determines that the index is between 0 and 1. An index close to 0 indicates a perfect distribution of racial groups across all census tracts in a region. So that would be a case of, if I took everybody, if I could play this game and I took everybody in a county, and I had the ability to distribute them equally among every neighborhood. So every neighborhood proportionately represented their share of residents in the county overall, I would have a perfect dissimilarity index. In reality, that rarely happens. Conversely, an index of 1 indicates perfect segregation. So it's everybody's segregated. Nobody lives near anybody who does not look like them. And that is high segregation. HUD gives you in the guidebook the indication of whether or not your, they call it the DI index is low, moderate, or high. There's a fair amount of literature out there that can help you understand how your DI index compares to neighboring communities. So there's some papers that have been done that have analyzed changes in DI over time. Those are useful to help your city leaders and yourselves understand how bad are we in terms of our DI measure. Do we look like surrounding communities or not? And then again, you ask that question of why are we different or why are we not different, and what does that mean for fair housing? HUD gives a caution that when your protected class population is very small, for example, under 1,000 people, the DI may yield interesting results. You may just not have enough people spread over your geographic area for those results to be meaningful. And that's important to communicate to your community leaders as well. The way that HUD has chosen to think about housing needs for the AFH is to use the disproportionate housing needs data. And for those of you who have done consolidated planning way back in 1994, when it was first required, there was something called the CHAS, the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy, that now we think of as a set of data that HUD collects from the census, gets the actual variables from the census, and then is able to repackage those data into something that HUD calls disproportionate housing needs. These data are available online. You can download the data and use a statistical program to analyze those, but HUD also provides the tables in both the Econ Plan Suite and will provide them as part of the AFH. The disproportionate housing needs data focus heavily on cost burden. And the reason is when we think about what's in the census data, what we can use to analyze housing needs, the easiest variable to produce that tells us a lot about affordability challenges for communities of every size is cost burden. Cost burden occurs when a household is paying more than 30% of their household income toward housing costs. And those variables are easy to get out of the census data, and they're a pretty good indication of needs in a community. So HUD focuses on the disproportionate housing needs data that are in CHAS, again, that are coming through the census, because it's the easiest way to show housing needs across all of the various jurisdictions for which the AFH will apply. It tells us a little bit, of course, about housing needs, but maybe not as much as you want to know about the challenges in your community. And so you have a couple of choices. You can focus on the disproportionate housing needs data, meet the bare minimum requirement of the AFH, and you should be fine as long as you answer these questions here that HUD poses in the AFH. I would advise you to do more. When you're doing your community outreach process, use that as an opportunity to inform where housing needs exist and why. So talk to people about their housing needs. And then if you have housing market studies that have been completed, either as part of a consolidated plan to supplement it or on their own, definitely bring that into the discussion. The disproportionate housing needs segment of the AFH is a pretty small part of what you really want to know about housing challenges in your community. The publicly supported housing patterns analysis is fairly new to the AFH. Some of you may have done this in the past with AIs. This has been something that we've been trying out in different forms over time because of a question that we got from a HUD reviewer a few years ago when we were doing a state plan. And that HUD reviewer asked the state told the state that they wanted to know how well people in different counties who had incomes that made them eligible for the state's programs were being served. So what is the difference between who the state is serving and the income eligible population county by county? And this got us thinking about what HUD wanted, which really I think is to understand, going back to HUD's mission under AFFH, how well those programs, those federal dollars, are benefiting people of different protected classes. To do that then, HUD asked you to do the following. Look at concentrations of racial and ethnic groups in public housing. Look at concentrations of voucher holders in certain neighborhoods. Think about who is concentrated and why, and what are the characteristics of those neighborhoods of concentration. Primarily, are they RCAPS and ECAPS, and what does that mean for the people who live there? HUD's also asking you to look at the difference in demographic composition of people living in assisted housing versus the income eligible population overall. The way to do that, and you need to have good program data to be able to do that. So at the state level, this gets a little tricky sometimes. It's really dependent on what your subrecipients are reporting back to you. But at a bare minimum, you should be able to say, these are the types of populations we have been serving with CDBG and home, for example. And this is how this compares to the income eligible population in that county. For that second piece, you can use census data. You could also do that at the local level. It's a little bit of an easier exercise at the local level. Then you ask the question of, are certain protected classes under or overrepresented, and why? So in this particular exercise we did for a state many years ago, that led to some focus groups in the counties where we saw that groups were underrepresented, as well as discussions with the subrecipients and the public housing authorities and the CAP agencies in those areas to help understand why people weren't using the programs afforded to them and for which they were available. We have found some difference in cultural sensitivities around using federal programs that then could lead to affirmative marketing for certain groups. So in going through this exercise, my recommendation would be to think about how you're going to use that data to inform your action plan. HUD also provides data for you to be able to look at the differences in siting of publicly assisted housing. These are not my favorite maps. HUD provides markers for LIHTC properties, for project-based Section 8, for you'll have maps that show density of voucher holders, and for public housing developments. The markers are fairly large, and you can see that they indicate areas of concentration pretty dramatically. I think that you all should be aware of those maps fueling a lot of NIMBYism, and be careful about how those maps are how they're shown in the AFH, and potentially scale them down a little bit so they have a better representation of reality. You also should be looking at, and we've done this a lot in past AIs, this was part of the AI guidance, the old AI guidance, looking at how your public housing authority is making decisions for preferences, the siting of the housing, how they're dealing with community opposition, impediments to mobility, if they have an active mobility program, if they're thinking about having one, and then the quality of the housing that they are offering. I would say the one downside of the AFH is that it does focus on publicly supported housing at the expense of privately supported housing. So there's not really a strong corollary to this looking at privately provided housing. Most of the AIs do that through an analysis of Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. There's some suggestion that that should be part of the AFH in the guidebook and in the template, but you don't have questions that are quite as pointed about what the data are showing. And I would invite you to apply these questions that are asked of the publicly supported housing patterns analysis to an analysis of privately provided housing, because it's a big part of our housing stock. The other potentially new item, unless you've been a Sustainable Communities grantee and you've done a FIA, is the disparities in access to opportunity. So in the past, we haven't really had terrific data unless it was collected locally to understand what housing patterns meant in the broader context of access to opportunity. A recent research study that was done by some Harvard economists really emphasized the importance of this and basically said a child moving to a neighborhood that is not high poverty, that offers more opportunity, will do better over time, particularly when they make that move if they are younger. And the data are pretty robust. So to that end, HUD has included a disparities in access to opportunity requirement of the AFH. This has not been a big part of AIs in the past, primarily because the data were hard to get. HUD's will provide you with a number of data, and I would invite you again, to the extent possible, to collect data on your own to help understand where barriers in access to opportunity exist. That might be quantitative data if it's easy for you to access, if you're already maintaining databases, or you have good relationships with your school district, for example, and can pull the data down very easily. But you also should be asking these questions through the surveys that you are doing, as well as in the focus groups that, or public meetings that you're conducting. Really understand, do people perceive that opportunity in their neighborhoods? What would they like to change if they could? And where are there barriers for them accessing opportunity? I'd like to quickly talk about some of the indices that HUD provides. Some of them, it's important to know some segments of this so you understand how to interpret those. The first is a low poverty index. This is a little bit hard to understand because intuitively it's a different scaling than the rest of these indicators. So high and low poverty is not necessarily good like the other indicators. So don't apply the same framework for understanding the indices just across the board. You need to think about each one index by index. The school proficiency index, when I said it's nice to be able to pull in local data on your educational performance and attainment, it's to supplement the school proficiency index because it is based on 4th grade state tests in reading and math. In a community like in a state like Colorado, where I live, we have open choice, and we also have a tremendous amount of magnet and charter school enrollment. So the school in a neighborhood may not necessarily represent opportunity to residents in a neighborhood in Denver Public Schools in our largest district. So be really cognizant of that and bring in local information to supplement the school proficiency index. I'd also encourage you to look at middle or junior high school scores when you're doing this analysis because those can change dramatically beyond a 4th grade state test. The reason, of course, HUD has focused on the 4th grade tests is because they're readily available. They're available across jurisdictions. So a lot of the data that are driving these indices were chosen because they're easy to provide to everybody. The labor engagement or market index, this measures human capital and labor market engagement by neighborhood. Depending on your access to employment and how easy it is to for neighbors and communities or residents of communities to be able to seek employment in their neighborhood, this may be a little bit difficult to understand, and you need to bring in supplemental employment data. So just because there is a lot of job opportunity in a neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that those are high-paying wages or that the residents have access to those jobs. So again, think about that a little more deeply. Jobs Proximity Index has some of the same challenges. In Denver, for example, we show very, very high jobs proximity to certain parts of the community, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy for all residents, particularly low-income residents, to get to those neighborhoods or to get to those places of employment, and they may or may not be able to live close by. There's also a transit trips index that looks at the likelihood that low-income renters could use public transit, a low transportation cost index, which are very nice ways to look at transportation access, and then an environmental health index, which looks at exposure to toxins. When we've looked at environmental health indices in the past, we've had challenges with the type of data that are collected at the state level, and that they include retailers like dry cleaning facilities. So make sure that you are understanding what's behind those data, what those data may represent relative to what you know about your community, because it could inflate environmental concerns. A disability and access analysis is probably the area where, it's not probably, it is the area where you have the least amount of data to work with, and you need to do a very good job of asking people in the community about the challenges that they face. And this again is driven simply by lack of data at the census level, particularly when it comes to housing and accessible, affordable housing. So there's not a variable that comes out of the census data. There's nothing nationally that we can apply to give communities an idea of how much accessible housing stock they have and how affordable that stock is. What you get out of the AFH is locational distribution by age and some reasons for your demographic patterns that you can garner through the density analysis. The nice thing about the separation of the maps by age, you get 18 to 64 and 65 plus, because disability is so highly correlated with older age, you can, and those services are different. An adult who has a disability probably has different needs, not always, but can have different needs than a senior with a disability. Those maps will help you understand where you should target disability services and how those differ in your community and how you can plan for future services such as home health care networks. One of the questions you're required to ask is there sufficient affordable and accessible housing in a range of unit sizes? This is where you don't have a whole lot of data to work with, and you need to be out there asking disability advocates, asking people with disabilities. I would encourage you to always have your facilities where you're holding any kind of focus group or public meeting should always be accessible and should be easy to get to for people in the disability community. So use those initial maps on where people with disabilities live to help you decide where you should be holding your public process, and then go through advocacies, networks, and stakeholders to advertise those meetings. A lot of times we'll go into independent living centers and do our focus groups there to make it easier for people to contribute to the discussion. You also need to look at to what extent do people with disabilities in or from the jurisdiction or the region reside in segregated or integrated settings. Again, this is mostly what you get through having conversations with people. You can do some mapping of group homes and marry that with the locational distribution maps, but this just requires a little more thinking and more work than has been typical in the past in an AI. The other element of the disability and access analysis that HUD is interested in, and some of this is very closely associated with the use of CDBG. So if you look at item A here, to what extent are persons with disabilities able to access the following and identify where there are barriers? So public infrastructure, can a person in a wheelchair move across a community in the same way that somebody who is not in a wheelchair can? How easily can they access transportation, proficient schools and educational programs? So are there special needs programs available or special ed programs available in schools? If not, how hard is it, or does the district make it available for children to get to the school that they need to be in? And then finally, how easy is it for people with disabilities to access jobs? And finally, what processes exist in the jurisdiction or the region for persons with disabilities to request and obtain reasonable accommodations or accessibility modifications? So are you using home to, are you allowing through your use of home, a home rehab program, people to put in wheelchair ramps, for example? Is there an easy way to figure out how I would ask for reasonable accommodation if I was a person with disability who needed to request my landlord make an accommodation for me? I was on the computer Googling around, where do I go, what do I do, how easy is it for me to get that information? And then finally, the fair housing contributing factors. So this element of the AI used to be called impediments. HUD at one point called them determinants when it was putting together the AFH, and we've landed on contributing factors. And those are defined by the rule as a factor that creates, contributes to, perpetuates, or increases the severity of one or more fair housing issues. So these are what you're focusing on at the end of your analysis. Basically, of the challenges, the fair housing challenges that we've identified in our community, what is causing, well, I shouldn't say cause, what is contributing to those challenges? I think HUD gives an excellent description of the variety of contributing factors that could lead to fair housing challenges. You see those that are listed in the guidebook. They begin on page 202, and they are defined on page 202, beginning on page 202. HUD spends a lot of time defining those contributing factors. This table lists those. They range from community opposition to location of employment to private discrimination. Read through these as you're starting your AFH process, not at the end. This is not something to start in the end, because you'll need to ask and think about how prevalent these contributing factors are in the challenges that are being identified along the way. So when we do our analysis, we'll typically stop, and I think this is a really nice checklist to have with you as you're trying to identify what's going on in the maps, in some of the data tables that HUD gives you, and certainly in what you're hearing from the community. Is this situation caused by XYZ contributing factors? Yes or no? And if so, how do we address this? I want to take a moment and talk about the AFH specifically applied to zoning, because HUD spends a little bit of time talking about zoning in particular in the AFH, and gives some examples of what you need to look at from a zoning perspective when you're going through the AFH process. I would use this as a bit of a checklist as you're doing a zoning analysis to make sure you cover all of these topics, and those include availability of affordable units in a range of sizes, integrated housing for persons with disabilities or persons who need supportive services. We talked about that in the disability and access area. Occupancy restrictions, are they reasonable, or do they lead to some kind of discrimination? Limits on multifamily developments and how that affects affordability in your community, as well as access to housing for protected classes. Facility spacing or dispersal requirements. So this would be, for example, a spacing requirement that a homeless shelter couldn't be too close to a community school. Think about making sure that you've got a business decision behind that you can rationalize why you have those spacing requirements if you were to ever be challenged. Special use permit requirements, are they reasonable, are they necessary, or is the result creating community opposition because of the requirements of public hearings that may or may not be needed. Growth management ordinances, as well as both the availability and really the outcomes of inclusionary zoning. So you may have an inclusionary zoning program that's not really producing housing that's benefiting the people who have that need. I think of this as a nice checklist that you all should be going through, not just for your AFH, but just in the practice of good planning. So to understand if our requirements of the development community are our zoning and land use ordinances achieving the right outcome. The final, but shouldn't be final, you should be thinking about this all along the way, is setting fair housing priorities and goals. And one of the things that I like about the AFH that I didn't think was necessarily as transparent in the old guidance is the prioritization piece. So HUD allows you to identify one or more contributing factors that your fair housing goals are going to address. Describe how the goal relates to the overall contributing factor and related fair housing issues. You need to identify metrics and milestones as well as who's going to do this. But you also have the option, and HUD's very clear in the guidebook about this, to say this is not a priority because of these reasons, or we don't really have authority to address this. I'm a community, for example, that would like to pass. I have a very high housing costs, and I think it would be useful for us to have inclusionary zoning, but our state prevents that because we have a rent control statute that has been interpreted to not let local communities implement inclusionary zoning. HUD encourages you to talk about that. You have the ability to say, we don't have the authority to affect this change. We're not responsible for this contributing factor. The other way that HUD wants you to look at this, which I think is a really good discipline, is to look at both space or place-based strategies as well as mobility-place strategies. So what you'll typically find in any relatively large urban area is you have access to opportunity. So neighborhoods that tend to have all of the things that residents want, regardless of their income level, and that helps them access opportunity, jobs, income progression, good educational attainment, but those may or may not be affordable. And then you have neighborhoods that are affordable that do not afford residents as much access to opportunity. So you focus on two different things. How do we help more people live in high opportunity areas? And then how do we help low opportunity areas become higher opportunity areas? And referencing back to the guidebook, page 124 walks through how do you set goals, how do you go through a strategic planning process. So you've got that out there outlined for you, and they've done a really good job of walking you through what that means in the context of AFH. So with that, I'm going to allow questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these emerging and very interesting issues that we'll know a lot about in the next year as the AFH is fully implemented, and that we probably see some lawsuits associated with the big changes that have happened in the last year.
Heidi, thanks so much. This has been a really interesting overview with some considerable detail into fair housing. And for someone who practices in the field, I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing. We have a lot of good questions, so I'm going to go right into it and start asking away. And this is a question from Donna. This is similar to a question that I wrote down as you were talking. And she asks, what if your community is very rural and homogeneous? And it has been for at least 100 years. We have only 2% minority population and persons with disabilities. We are representative throughout the county. How does HUD view this type of rural 98% Caucasian community? Technically, we look like we are a non-inclusive community. And so I'm looking at this from the perspective of a state, New Hampshire, which is a very white state. And you know, how do we deal with these issues of looking at racial desegregation So, for example, the dissimilarity, so New Hampshire might have a very low dissimilarity index, but that's simply because, you know, the population is pretty evenly distributed. We simply don't have a high percentage of minority population.
That's a very, very good question. When we were helping with the initial version of the AFH template, the question of should we have a different template for small communities came up, and we felt like absolutely yes. I do think that the AFH is a bit skewed toward urban areas, and it does raise some challenges for small communities, particularly communities that don't get a lot of CDBG. So that may be in the works. I'm not sure about that, but at least HUD was thinking about that at the time that we were helping with the initial AFH template. I think the AFH tool affords you the opportunity to, especially if you're in a small area, fairly rural, uncomplicated by many of these, or as measured by many of these indicators, you can do this in a pretty slick way using what HUD gives you. And you need to have a lot of reasoning for why the data look like they do. I would not focus as much on the racial and ethnic piece of this. Simply explain why your community looks the way it does and focus more on disability and access. Because if you're a rural community in America, you're probably aging very quickly. And simply say our priority is on serving persons with disabilities in our community. That's our largest protected class. And this is where we feel like our resources would benefit a protected class the most.
Great, thanks. Early in your presentation, you enumerated the protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And one thing I was observing as you were talking was that there may be additional protected classes under state law. So, for example, in New Hampshire, we have marital status and sexual orientation as protected classes in our anti-discrimination laws. And you mentioned also in one of your slides the trend toward looking at source of income discrimination. And so this is a question from Stephen. Would you please explain the concept of income source discrimination?
Sure. So source of income discrimination basically refers to Section 8. So that landlords can choose not to take, landlords in most states under the Federal Fair Housing Act can choose not to accept Section 8 voucher holders or housing choice voucher holders. They don't have to accept them in their program. They don't have to provide housing to those individuals. Some states, a handful of states, have chosen to protect residents based on source of income, meaning that, and sometimes it's specific to Section 8, but it's generally not. So it would be more broad. If your income are coming from SSDI, if you're disabled, if you are a Section 8 voucher holder. In Colorado, you may apply income from the marijuana industry, for example. You cannot discriminate based on where that money comes from. Criminal activity, though, is actually exempt from most source of income statutes. So it's just the idea mostly that having source of income protections affords more opportunities for Section 8 voucher holders. Back to your initial question about what if you have state laws that offer additional protections. You have the opportunity and you should talk about those additional protections both at the state and local level as part of the Fair Housing Enforcement and Resources section, but you won't have data provided by HUD specific to those state law protections. You may, and I would encourage you when you're looking at polling, we typically pull complaint data and legal cases from the U.S. Department of Justice. We do Freedom of Information Act requests to HUD to get complaint data, and then to the extent that we can get that at the state or local level, we pull those data in as well. So that should round out your complaint data so that you can see where discrimination may be prevalent both at the federal as well as the state level. And then when you're doing community process, talk to people about that too. the source of income, I think, it's an interesting question right now. The city of Austin, which is one of our former clients, passed a source of income ordinance last fall, was then sued by an apartment association, and the legislature reacted by prohibiting protected class that includes source of income. So I think that piece of it is going to play out through, the legality of that will play out through the courts over the next couple of years.
Right. I know here in New Hampshire, the state legislature considered a bill, I think 2 years ago, that would have added source of income discrimination as effectively as a protected class statewide. But those things, of course, are enforceable not by the federal government, not by HUD, because that would be a state law. And until HUD adopts that or Congress adopts it as a standard, it's only enforceable at the local or state jurisdiction. Isn't that right?
That's true. HUD does ask in the AFH if you have source of income protections at the state or local level. So there is some indication that HUD thinks that is a good thing. And it might be useful if you have the time and data to look at whether or not that is affording people more opportunity. There are a couple, we've looked at source of income research to see where the literature is and how clear the data may be about source of income affording more opportunity. It's a little murky right now. It would be lovely to be able to compare a state or a locality with source of income versus one that doesn't have that, all other things being equal. So rent levels, provision of availability of rental units. I'm not aware of anything like that, but it would be nice to have more information basically to understand the success of source of income laws.
Okay, here's a question from Gregory. As communities may be moving away from housing disparities, I think he means discrimination, actually based on race or ethnicity, and more toward economic and income-based disparities, that is a recognition of severe income inequality from block to block or neighborhood to neighborhood, do you anticipate that the regulatory direction from the federal government will eventually shift toward remedies that attempt to address fair housing in the context of only income segregation rather than segregation or discrimination based on race and ethnicity?
That's a very good question. I think that depends on politics, and also certainly influenced by the constitutional limitations of what the federal government can do. So there's been a lot of concern over the AFH, and some people feel like the AFH suggests that HUD is empowered to require a community to make certain land use and zoning decisions. HUD doesn't have that authority. They can ask you as part of your AFFH requirement what you as a community are doing to further fair housing choice. But at this point, I think with the United States politics where they are, I personally feel like we're pretty far away from looking at fair housing through income segregation. The one kind of, I think, problematic but also interesting aspect of the federal fair housing law is that it's really, really, really simplistic. And that's because it was a bit of a rush job. So it was passed after a lot of politics and a lot of controversy associated with what should be in the initial Civil Rights Act, and was certainly influenced by Kennedy's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination. So it was put together rather quickly, meaning that the case law informs a lot of it. And to that, there's some elements of addressing income segregation or some interpretation of that out of the Federal Fair Housing Act. But it feels to me like a big jump to go from the very defined protected classes that are in the Federal Fair Housing Act to a broad ruling that there needs to be equity in people of different incomes, neighborhood by neighborhood.
Certainly, I'm thinking about the enforcement against Westchester County by the U.S. Department of Justice, and that they were there if I'm recalling the facts right, they're using income disparities as kind of a surrogate to get to a demonstration that racial discrimination had in fact occurred.
Right. My understanding, and I'm familiar with that case as a researcher and a fair housing consultant, but not as a lawyer. The nuance about Westchester, however, is that it was brought under the Federal False Claims Act. So it basically said Westchester County had not been honest in their AI about what was going on in the community. I certainly think that was the impetus, and there have been similar cases throughout the country where HUD has been a party to the lawsuit and caused us to think more about the relationship between income segregation and race and ethnicity, or economic segregation and race and ethnicity. And that kind of, to go back to what I was talking about with the different types of strategies, both place-based and mobility-based, that's the right way to approach this, not only because we're worried about getting sued under a Westchester-style situation, but because it's the right way to address, there are a lot of good economic development reasons to address areas of concentrated poverty. And so I guess I would step away from, if I were a planner in a community or community leader, I try not to focus so much on, are we going to get sued, and oh my goodness, is HUD going to take over our land use and zoning powers, and think more about what makes sense from an economic development perspective. There's really, really clear and robust research now linking mobility out of high poverty neighborhoods, but there's always been good research linking early educational intervention in low-income households to a lot of economic progress later on. So focusing more on how do we help the low-income people in our community achieve more self-sufficiency, educational attainment, and income attainment, versus what do we need to do to avoid getting sued?
Here's a fairly simple question that probably has a complex answer. How is the region defined for a state? And this may be a reference to an RCAP.
Right. So region, HUD doesn't get very specific in defining region in the AFH. HUD suggests that regional AIs are desirable, but it only specifically defines the types of regions that fall under the AFH in that table that I showed, where we have the different types of regional groupings that then dictate an AFH or do not. So you can define a region as governments and a public housing authority. You can define a region as just a couple of governments working together. It's really up to what you think makes sense for your market.
So let's see. Jonathan is asking, are there any other fair housing cases working their way up to the Supreme Court, and how might the how might the recent vacancy on the Supreme Court, this is with the recent death of Justice Scalia, how might they affect any near future decisions?
You know, I'm not aware of any. I suspect that the affirmative action case before the court could help us think differently about fair housing. But, you know, I'm not sure, and I don't know. I think the big case was last year, and I don't think that, I don't expect that we'll see anything at the Supreme Court level, but much more at the local or state level in the next couple of years.
Okay, Dean asks, do you have any advice on the level of effort, for example, person hours, required to complete an AFH? Or are there any rules of thumb regarding the level of effort required to prepare an AFH based on population? So, for example, how many person weeks per 1,000 residents?
That's a very, very good question. Typically, HUD has a number of person hours that are required to complete their requirements. I'm not aware of, or I'm not sure of what that is for the AFH. And yes, it will vary depending on your community and the sophistication of your community. Not as much in the, remember you're provided with the data and the maps, and those, that information will be equitable whether or not you're small or big. If you're very big and sophisticated, where you would want to add more person hours is in two areas. The data that HUD is giving you is a 5-year span of the American Community Survey, and the reasoning is that's what was needed to get to the small to get data for the small jurisdictions. So if you're in a bigger community and your council, and many city councils really care about the most current data, you'll probably want to pull your own data for some of the maps. The 5-year span is not a bad way to approach this. It's obviously rational and logical from HUD's perspective with what they were trying to achieve, and it would give you the direction of what's going on. So if I compared a 2007 to 2014 map that used ACS with something that just used 2014, there will be some differences, but they wouldn't be really, really, really big in most communities, except in communities that developed really fast over that time period toward the latter end. So you would probably want to pull your own data just because it's generally more important for community leaders to see current data. That's typically what they ask for in our experience. You're also going to need to do a lot more community outreach. So you'll want to get, because if you're a big community, you're probably more racially and ethnically diverse. You'll need to get, and you have more protected classes represented in your community. So you'll just want to get more input from a broader segmentation of the community. You'll need to do, we typically will do our planning meetings, our focus groups in RCAPS and ECAPS are really closely adjacent to RCAPS and ECAPS. You'll have more of them because you're more complicated. It really depends in terms of sort of budget and person hours, really depends on the community process. So the actual execution of the template is a fairly predictable exercise. Where our budgets vary considerably is how much effort you put in community process.
Of course, this is something that you are intimately familiar with, and for anyone who has tackled a new IRS form when they're doing their taxes, there is a Paperwork Reduction Act statement of how long it's supposed to take you. Things tend to take longer. We have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
We have a question here now from Kirby. Could you tell us just a little more about what disparate impact is and what it means?
Sure. And one quick add-on to that last question. I mean, my guess is that your most basic AFH would probably be 200 hours, if that helps at all.
Great, thank you.
Disparate impact is the idea that, or the, it's more than an idea, the concept, the effect that a policy could be discriminatory even though it does not directly discriminate. So I could have a housing program that has very high preferences for low-income seniors, but that's not really where my primary need is. It's actually for low-income families. My program then could not, I'm not trying to directly discriminate, but it could disproportionately affect the access to choice that a low-income family would have. So it's just simply the concept that you can have a policy or a program in place that doesn't really mean to discriminate. You may have not intended it. You didn't even think that it could have a discriminatory effect, but in practice, it causes some kind of discriminatory effect.
So it's really about the patterns, not intention.
Yes, that's the difference with disparate impact. That you actually have, your policy or program creates a disparate impact.
Okay, here's a question from Donna, and this is really, I think, based in the distinction between place-based versus mobility-based strategies. She asks, has HUD taken into account smart growth initiatives which focus low-income housing to be located near services? thus in all areas, but especially rural areas, low-income folks are located in the areas with more density. And are these explanations acknowledged by HUD?
I don't know the answer to that. I would assume yes, that there is some. You could use that rationale to explain some of the patterns in your community that could be misinterpreted. A lot of the enforcement of the AFH really depends on your region's approach to reviewing these documents, much like the AI. And I would encourage you to, based on your past relationship with your HUD representatives, to understand, to the extent possible, what you think HUD's going to be focusing on when they're reviewing your AFH. So in some communities, HUD's very, very involved in initiatives like smart growth initiatives and may certainly understand the patterns that take place in a community. In other places, they're not. So it's a vague answer to that question. I think it really, really, really varies. The other thing that if I were completing an AI and I was your community, I also would pay special attention, even if you're doing an AI now and you're not required to do the AFH, look really closely at that guidebook. That gives you a very good idea of how HUD is thinking about fair housing right now. And if you do get in a situation where you have a difference of opinion with how HUD sees your community and how you see your community, refer to that. You may be able to refer to that guidebook to say, this is why we're doing what we're doing, this is how we understand what's going on, and that could potentially work in your favor.
So we have a question here also from a different Donna. We have a couple of Donnas on board today. She asks, here in New Jersey, we are struggling through the most recent version of the Affordable Housing Obligation Avoidance Scheme. Not to put too fine a point on it. Will the new AFH tool potentially help show where communities are segregating classes of people by zoning for affordable housing by site or location rather than taking a more inclusive approach? Will this information be able to be seen by the general public? Really, she's asking, can this be used as an enforcement tool?
I think so, based on the maps that I've seen out of the AFH. So you'll have, when we're talking about the publicly assisted housing segment of the AFH and the maps that are produced, you can see pretty dramatically where affordable housing is located. Now, that is just publicly assisted housing, however. So if you wanted to look at affordable rentals, for example, that are provided privately, you probably need to pull that data on your own and supplement those maps with what you can get out of the census. What you could do, we haven't, I would say, mastered the art of taking the AFH maps out of the GIS template or tool and putting them, other than through a screenshot, in a Word document, for example. I think that is forthcoming. But in a perfect world, you could take some of those dot density maps, the data that, or the RCAPS and ECAPS even better, that HUD gives you in your AFH, and overlay that with data that you pull from the census that you have available to you to demonstrate where there may be patterns of potentially discrimination, or certainly the avoidance that you're talking about. It's a little trickier to link that then to land use and zoning issues, although it's not in some communities. So if you have communities that exclusively zone out multifamily housing, either directly or through community opposition and planning decisions, you could also do some overlays, or at least imagine where decisions, you could imagine mapping where decisions have failed onto some of these maps that HUD's giving you to show some pretty interesting patterns. So I would think outside the box more than what is HUD giving us. HUD is helping you tell a story of what's going on in your community. So don't think of this as much as the econ template where I just have to answer a bunch of questions and talk about data and tell HUD how I'm going to use the dollars. This is more of HUD's giving you a lot of tools to tell a story, and you have a lot to add to that story. And then you need to tell HUD how you plan to make that outcome of that story better.
Now, getting to the final point of this, serious liability, Candace asks, how will HUD hold jurisdictions accountable to implement specific fair housing strategies, and what happens to each annual action plan?
I don't think we know that entirely. At the most basic level, HUD can withhold your CDBG or home funds. So, I mean, and that's where the power of this exists. HUD has the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing through its program administration. That is required of HUD in the Federal Fair Housing Act. So then when you sign that line on your CDBG certification, you are promising to do that as well on behalf of HUD. If you don't, then obviously HUD can withhold your funds or make you pay back your money. So that would be the most extreme level. On a practical side, this is a big document. You know, HUD's going to be reviewing these more actively than they have reviewed AIs in the past. So I think that it will if you think about this on a logical level, it will really be, it's kind of like IRS audits, right? I mean, the big violators are what HUD will be able to detect and focus on. Some of that will be informed by what's going on in your community. So if you have a lot of fair housing lawsuits, if you have advocates who are really pushing you to make change, my advice would be to listen to those individuals, have them at the table, even though if that can be a hard space to occupy if you've been adversaries in the past. But this is, there are a lot of communities who are going to be completing this document. If you are on the radar, because there have been a lot of fair housing lawsuits or a lot of complaints, I think just reasonably you could expect that HUD would be paying more attention to your community. And you probably need to make a better, do a better AFH than a community that maybe is not on the radar. That doesn't sound equitable, it doesn't sound entirely fair, but I think that is a likely situation.
Well, Heidi, we are at the end of our webcast. It's now 2:30, and I want to thank you for this excellent discussion of fair housing implications and what HUD is doing and what we have to do in response. To everyone, I remind you, if you want to log in your credits, you can go to your My APA account and search under the Housing and Community Development Division for this webcast. And that brings us to the end, and we'll see you on the next webcast. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.